is a man born in Keta, grew up in Adabraka here in Accra, and started school at a very early age. At age 18, he's one of two persons who obtained a first-class LLB at the time. 12 years ago, he had an encounter with the law which he has described as a very strange experience. 12 years on, what does this experience mean to him, and what impact has it had on the dispensation of justice in this country? My guest is lawyer Tsatsu Tsikata, former CEO of the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation, telling his story 12 years on. Lawyer Tsatsu Tsikata, it's good to have you. Thank you so much for making the time to sit with us.
Thank you. It's good to be with you again. TV3 actually was a station I used to watch in prison.
Wow, you used to watch TV3 in prison?
Yes.
Interesting. Oh, but we're privileged to know this. Is it that it was a choice you made?
No, in the
there?
cell where I was with about 11 other people, the TV used to be turned onto that station.
Wow.
And so I paid a lot of attention.
To TV3. And guess what? 12 years on, you're here.
That's
telling
right.
the story out of prison. I wonder how the experience was watching TV3 from the prisons. Want to share with us?
You know, it was really the time when I paid attention to TV3. I must be honest with you, because I don't watch television a lot.
Yeah.
But I found the range of programs very interesting, and the news broadcasts on TV3, seem to be really, up to date with information. So it was good.
It's been so long. Where have you been? What have you been up to over the period of being away from the public?
By God's grace, I've been doing well. I think that, we all should look at this situation with the pandemic perhaps from a kind of optimistic perspective. I've never heard such quiet around me as I did in the first few days of the lockdown situation. You hardly heard any traffic around.
That's right.
And I've seen pictures of empty streets in the big capitals of the world, in London,
Yes.
in Geneva, and what have you, in the US, in China. And so for me, it's been a moment to stop and reflect.
That's right.
And I think that, there are going to be better times coming out of all of that. And I'm hopeful, and I'm praying that for us as a country also, there may be some lessons learned that may take us into the future on a stronger and more exciting note.
But you've been on the quiet. And we're wondering what you've been doing over the period.
Well, I've since I left GMPC as chief executive, I've been on my own with an oil and gas company that has done work both in Ghana and internationally. And so a lot of my work in the last 10 years or so has really been outside the country, in different places. And at the same time, of course, I follow what's going on. It meant that I traveled a lot, and that is why I said that this period has been a more refreshing, stay at home, quiet reflection period for me, and I'm grateful for that change in the pace of my life.
Now, 12 years ago, what happened? Looking back now, 12 years on, how do you feel about the whole experience, if you're telling it today?
It was such an unexpected and extraordinary event that day, June 18, 2008. But as I look back now, I take it as something that happened, unfortunate as it was. It took me through a further 5 months in which I experienced what I can only call a lot of blessing from God. And so when I look back, I do not think of it as something terrible that I went through and feel bitter or angry or anything like that. Rather, I'm thankful to God that I went through that valley and was able to come out still alive. I could have been dead, as you know, because I had a very bad asthmatic attack by the end. But by God's grace, I'm still alive. And so I have a lot to thank God for. I have a lot to be grateful for in terms of the support that I received from my wife, my siblings, my mother, members of my family, and indeed people whom I have never met and will probably never meet all around the country and indeed in other parts of the world who, had such an amazing solidarity with me, and I would never be able to forget those experiences. So altogether, it is a picture that is full of gratitude and that essentially recognizes important lessons learned, and I think that I've gone ahead, I've gone on in my life in a way that again I really can't have any regrets about.
Yeah. And I've seen correspondence, that went on prior to the trial, and you made the point earlier that you knew that you were going to go to jail. What gave you that conviction prior to before everything played out, that this was going to happen?
There was a determination on the part of the government of the day from 2001 to have me sent to prison. I mean, it was something that was very well known. It was said that by hook or by crook, I had to be put behind bars. And so I went through a situation where initially I was taken before a circuit court. The case was withdrawn. Then I was put before the so-called fast-track High Court. And then I challenged the constitutionality of that fast-track High Court. The Supreme Court decided in my favor, only to have the situation where new judges were appointed, a review panel,
and then the decision overturned.
The decision was overturned from 5-4 in my favor to 6-5 against me. But even further, after the decision that went in my favor, the government and the Attorney General at the time decided to have me put before the normal High Court. So before the normal High Court also, the case was thrown out. It was thrown out on the basis that I was charged with an offense, which at the time that I was supposed to have done the acts was not yet an offense.
In the law.
I was supposed to have done something in February, and the law came into force in July. And so I was put before a normal High Court on that basis. The case was thrown out. But even after that was also thrown out, the Deputy Attorney General at the time announced that they were going to continue and so on. So I think the determination to have me, at all costs put into jail was very clear to me. But what was also clear to me was that I was innocent, but that this was going to be orchestrated in the way that would end up, with what the political powers that be thought they wanted to achieve, unfortunately.
There was a lot of activity while you were in jail then. Prior to your going to jail, the Free Tsatsu movement and others who held the opinion that the law played out as you have described it strangely in your case. But why do you think that the executive at the time wanted you in jail at all costs if there was no reason to pursue that path?
I think you need to ask them that question, but I'm sure you understand the political situation. A new government had come into power. They were carrying on a propaganda war against the previous government under President Rawlings, and people like me who were seen as associated with President Rawlings, were targets. I'm sure you recall that history. So in that context, I suppose they needed some people to use as scapegoats, and I happen to be one of those.
Prior to going into prison, the many events that characterized that period. But in prison, is there any significant experience that you look back 12 years ago that you hold on to that shaped, your thinking, that shaped that aspect of your worldview that you look back and today, 12 years on, you still hold on to?
Well, yeah, many things. As I like to recall, the first day that I sat in a prison cell in the sort of early evening at Nsawam, as I sat on that bed in the corner of that cell, I could still hear birds chirping and singing around. And it struck me that this was probably a place where, again, I would be perhaps kept quiet for a period. I tell the story of the first Sunday in prison when the pastor who came from Asamankasi, Pastor Jones Owusu, he came with a lady to minister in song before he preached. And before the lady sang, when she stood in front of this church congregation in prison, she said, "You are in the right place at the right time." This was, she didn't know me. She wasn't saying it specifically to me, but it was a word that was meant for me. And it was followed by a powerful sermon from Pastor Jones, which used the verses in the Bible, Genesis 50:20, you meant it for good. Joseph saying to his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And then, for our present sufferings are nothing compared to the eternal glory that is set before us, from Romans 8:18. And it was extraordinary for me, the choice of passages that pastor used. And those were some of the deepest, spiritual lessons for me from that time. And I've remained, close to Pastor Jones. I believe that he had a word for me on that first Sunday in prison. It was interesting that around that same time, I had a book about the Joseph story. Again, right. God meant it for good. I had a book sent to me in prison, by my sister.
Wow.
So the message was clear to me. I really just had to use that time in the best possible way. And again, fortunately, there were many lessons to be learned from the experiences of other people, other prisoners, people who were experiencing what was unbelievable to me as a lawyer. Some people had been on remand in prison for more than 10 years and things like that, So that was not a wasted period. It was a new university education.
You came face to face with the realities of what happens behind bars.
And what happens to a lot of people in terms of their experience of the law. I, as a lawyer,
that's right,
being represented by, very good friends who are lawyers and so on, my experience was somewhat different from some people who did not even have access to legal counsel, and some of whom, whilst they were in prison, when they heard I was there, would come seeking my assistance in their cases, and I would get to find out things that really baffled me. Somebody, a young under 16-year-old in a prison context. I mean, he wasn't supposed to be there, but he and his older brother were hauled into prison and so on. So, as I keep insisting, those were not wasted months at all. I also, of course, spent the time, pursuing various steps in my case, including steps before the Supreme Court, also asking for bail, including asking for bail before the very judge who had put me behind bars. I had asked the Chief Justice to change the judge because of her clear bias against me, and particularly because there was evidence of a young journalist who happened to be around her courts a few days after her judgment against me, and who heard her directly say that she's heard that I have asked for bail, and that they should put it on her docket for a particular day, and she's going to throw it out. She had already made up her mind without even hearing me. So with all this material, I asked for the matter to be transferred to another judge. The Chief Justice said no, she wouldn't do that. It should go through judicial process. So I applied before her to have her take herself off the case because of bias, to recuse herself. She refused, and she insisted on proceeding with the case. So there were a lot of steps that I was taking from prison, particularly as at that time my lawyer had traveled, which had been made known to the judge, and she set all that aside in order to do what she did on June 18th. June 18th was never a date on which judgment was supposed to be given in my case. It was never billed. No notice had been given that judgment would be given. What was before the court was an application that we had made, originally scheduled for July, in which we asked the court for evidence to be brought from the Supreme Court of what the Attorney General at that time, Joe Garte, had said, acknowledging that the project in relation to which I was being accused of causing financial loss was actually a viable, feasible project. He had acknowledged that in the Supreme Court, because in the Supreme Court, we were asking that the IFC, which had claimed immunity, should be compelled, to come and testify, because they were part of the advisory group to enable the decision to be made on that project. In spite of that, the court decided to proceed, and on that particular day, in fact, the judge had not sat for more than, I would say, a year and a half, because she kept adjourning the case, awaiting the decision first of the Court of Appeal and then of the Supreme Court. And then suddenly I go to court on a day when no notice has been given that I'm going to be facing judgment. And the judge simply says, I'm going to go on. When I remind her that she herself had said that she's going to wait for the appeal processes, including the Supreme Court decision, to be finalized, she then suddenly says, I rescind my decision, I rescind my decision. So in a moment, she rescinded her decision to hold off the proceedings until the Supreme Court had given a judgment. And the Supreme Court judgment was supposed to be the following week on June 25th. So it was just an extraordinary situation.
We're going to get into the other bit about how all of this informs your position about the judiciary then. But it's an exclusive interview with lawyer Tsatsu. We'll be back after this quick break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to this exclusive interview with lawyer Tsatsu. Before the break, you were talking about how some of the incidents you describe as strange happened to you, and you questioned the independence of the judiciary then as it ought to be. Has anything changed where you sit now?
Well, I can talk specifically about that experience and matters related around it, because in that period, there were decisions given against me which were indeed very difficult to reconcile with the clear language of the law. For instance, in connection with this issue of whether the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, has immunity, I faced a situation where the Court of Appeal actually used the immunity of another international organization, the International Monetary Fund, and read it as if it was the immunity
of the IFC.
The IFC. I mean, that was a clear legal error. When you read the statute governing the IMF, it was in different terms from the statute governing the IFC. So it was difficult to understand. Fortunately, I have to say, in 2011, the Supreme Court reversed that particular decision. But the High Court had decided wrongly against me. The Court of Appeal had decided wrongly against me. It took the Supreme Court to reverse that particular decision. Again, thank God that the decision of June 18th itself was reversed on November 30th, 2016. And I was acquitted and discharged eventually. So it may have taken 8 years and more, but in the end, I believe I was vindicated. So when I look at the whole situation, the determination to get me and to have me jailed and so on was there. Unfortunately, it affected some of the judicial decision making, which was very strange. You just have to read the transcript of the proceedings before Her Ladyship Justice Henrietta Aban on June 18, 2008, just to see how things went. I mean, she was not going to listen to anything I said, reminding her of her own earlier decision to stay proceedings until the appeal was heard didn't make a difference, reminding her of the fact that my lawyer had written to the court to indicate that he had to be out of the country, and originally July had been set for the case. It had been brought forward at her behest. None of that seemed to make a difference. In fact, when I said my lawyer is out, she said, "But you're a lawyer yourself, so But but I have a constitutional right to counsel, even if I'm a lawyer myself." So these are the things that make you recognize that this is not a case in which an independent judicial decision is being given, in accordance with the laws of Ghana. It's unfortunate. I mean, judges swear an oath to, do justice in accordance with the law and so on, but unfortunately, sometimes they stray away.
No, let's get into the pardon, which you rejected. I mean, you wrote a handwritten letter, of which I have a copy of, to former President John Ejekun Kufuor on the 6th of January. That is just exactly a day before he was going out of office, on the 7th of January, handing over power to President John Evans Atta-Mills. Same day, you were granted amnesty. That's on the 6th of January. Now, in that letter, you described the former president's kind gesture of giving you presidential pardon as the height of hypocrisy. Why did you resort to these words to describe what was supposed to be a pardon?
Well, from everything that I had gone through since 2001, when former President Kufuor came to power, it was clear that I was a target of his agenda. And so when, after I had gone through even June 18th and being imprisoned. And then on his last day in office, I'm actually lying down on my hospital bed, actually, not sitting. I'm lying down on my hospital bed in, Kolebu at the Cardiothoracic Center. And somebody from the prisons directorate comes to inform me, accompanied by the then head of the Cardiothoracic Center, Dr. Frimpong Boateng, Professor Frimpong Boateng, now a minister. And the gentleman from the prison directorate comes to say to me that, I've been given a pardon. And so I first of all asked for whatever documentation he had. He wouldn't give me the documentation. But I was not going to accept that pardon. As I wrote in the letter to President Kufuor, my quest was for justice. It was not for his mercy. I had no need for his mercy or his favor. I was seeking justice. And he knew at the time that I had appealed. I appealed the very day that I was sentenced to prison. And he clearly had been following issues in my case from the beginning. So he knew that, my quest was to have my appeal heard and to be vindicated, to have my convictions set aside. That was important for me because I knew I was innocent.
So
and I was not going to allow his pardon to get in the way of my seeking justice.
So accepting the pardon to you would have been accepting the guilt.
Absolutely. That's exactly
incident that you are pleading
That's
innocent
exactly
of.
right. A pardon means that your conviction stands, but we're taking away the punishment. So you don't have to experience the punishment with that comes with the crime. But I wasn't prepared to accept that. I was determined to have my guilt set aside and to have an acquittal and discharge as the outcome of that case.
Some have said that it was a very risky path, an option that you took, because rejecting a presidential pardon, how about and going for appeal? How about if you had lost the appeal?
I was prepared to take that risk, and I was prepared to take that risk because I knew how outrageous what had happened on June 18th was. I did not believe that any court of appeal, looking at what happened, objectively, could possibly regard that as justice having been done. And I was proved right, and the Court of Appeal decisively, by unanimous decision, recognized that there had been a miscarriage of justice as they themselves expressed it.
There are a lot of people out there, who would learn from you. And let me just say this. I saw a headline that read, "Tsatsu rejects Kufuor's pardon, but he walks out of jail."
Well, actually, I didn't. I didn't walk out of jail. I was literally taken out of jail on November 16th, virtually dying, and taken to hospital. And by then, of course, the pardon had not arrived. I was taken out on November 16th to hospital, and I spent the period from November 16th until the pardon in the hospital. But during that time, I also succeeded in getting the Court of Appeal to reverse a decision of the same Justice Henrietta Alban, where she was refusing to grant me bail because I had applied for bail and she refused. But in December that year, the Court of Appeal overturned her refusal to grant me bail and said that the matter should go back to the High Court. So sometime in January, so basically I had applied for bail to the courts. And eventually in January, sometime not many days after this letter of pardon, I was actually granted bail by a high court. So my being out of prison was not because I just walked out after I'd been granted a pardon. The interesting thing, of course, was that since I was in hospital at the time, the director of the prison, the director of prisons who came to give me the information, withdrew the prison guards who were guarding me at the hospital. So it's true that as of then, I didn't have any more prison, guard or anything like that. But I didn't just walk out of jail. And I pursued the legal route of getting bail pending appeal, which I did obtain.
You'd say that Justice Henrietta Taban was doing her job as a judge, but you had been practicing as a lawyer prior to this moment. Was there any way you crossed her path before this, and a description of how you say she handled the case? Anything prior to that moment that gave you indication that there was something that she was getting at?
I cannot imagine it was a personal vendetta. She was my senior by a year in the law faculty in Legon. I never had any encounter with her which should make me believe that she had a personal vendetta. But I think, as I've insisted, it was a politically driven agenda. And she was unfortunately a tool of that political agenda.
From 2008 all the way to 2016, that's a long period to be engaged in an appeal of a sentence that in court. So what was running through your mind? What was happening? How was life like during that long period of appeal?
It was not an easy time. I was trying to combine the work I was doing as a consultant in my oil and gas field, especially outside the country. I was trying to combine that with having to attend, court proceedings, especially because I was trying to push for my appeal to be heard. After the bail had been granted, I still wanted the appeal to be heard. Unfortunately, the court processes, including the preparation of the appeal record and all that, took some time. I remember there was a time when we had an initial hearing in the Court of Appeal, and the judges found that the font for the appeal record was in too small a size, and they couldn't read the record properly. So they asked for that record of appeal to be redone. And unfortunately, that itself took more than a year to have done.
More than a year?
Several years, I would say, because this would have been around 2010, 2011. Mm-hmm. And getting that record eventually done, and then the case taken back before the appeal judges, took the next 4 or 5 years. And so it was really around May, June
Why that long?
2000. Well, those are the administrative processes of the judiciary, I'm afraid. I have no control over those processes. So in the end, it was around June when the case started being heard in the Court of Appeal, continued in October, and then finally November 30th, a decision was given by the Court of Appeal. The wheels of justice, they say, grind slowly.
Let me find out this. Have you come across the former president, John Agyekum Kufuor, since? Have your paths crossed? Have you met? Did you talk to him?
Yes, I have a few times. Usually it's been on a flight,
On a flight. Did
I
you
think,
talk?
Yes, my wife and I were on a flight. I remember once, and he, greeted us, and we returned the greeting and, exchanged a few pleasantries. But we've never had a chance for any extended face-to-face contact.
You maintain a certain cordial relationship when you meet.
I never bore him any grudge. I think that I maintained my regard for him as a president and so on at all times. In fact, before then, of course, I knew him in his personal capacity. But I found unfortunate what I had to go through at his hands. And that is why in my letter rejecting his pardon, I also pointed out that what he was doing was in bad faith, because I really did not see the basis for all that he had put me through. But in spite of that, life goes on, and by God's grace, I'm still here.
Now, during the 10th anniversary of this experience, that was in 2018, you wrote a piece, and that's 10 years on, overflow of praise. That's how you titled the piece that you wrote, A Decade After Your Conviction. And you sounded very biblical and spiritual in that, citing a number of experiences as well. It's always been the case with you?
Oh yeah, I've been a Christian since my scripture union days in infant swim school. And of course, before that, you know, my parents as Christians brought me up in a Christian manner. But I just want to touch on one aspect of that piece. That title actually came from Psalm 63, I think it was. And I came across the Passion Translation of Psalm 63 during that period, and I had not previously paid attention to that particular translation. And I was so struck by the power, the language of that translation. I overflow with praise when I come before you. The anointing of your presence, you know, I mean, fills me with pleasure. I mean, it was such a powerful rendition of that psalm, which I was very familiar with. And that's where the overflow of praise
title
came from.
So since your release from Islam prison, have you gone back there over the 12-year period?
I have been back at the Nsawam prison. In fact, around the time of the 10th anniversary of the day I was sent to prison, the pastor who preached on the first Sunday, Pastor Jones, he had organized, together with some others, a medical outreach program to go and provide medical help to some of the inmates as well as prison officers. And that was for a Saturday. And so I actually, together with my wife Esther, you know, I participated in that outreach program. You know, we got together all the needed materials and so on for them to undertake surgeries, as well as, you know, medication for them to provide consulting services to a number of the patients and the prison officers. And it was a really, exciting occasion for me, because on that day, the doctors, and these were just doctors who volunteered their services, you know, to take part in this outreach. They must have conducted over 20 surgeries. They were also, you know, able to handle probably over 100 prisoners as well as prison officers who needed some attention, because it lasted through the whole day. And something happened on that day in my interaction, which I'll never forget, my interaction with the prisoners. Because one of them came to me and just looked at me and said, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "Yes, I remember you." So he reminded me that he's the one who, on my last day, Saturday the 15th of November, in the prison, he had come to me with a request that another prisoner had a bad asthmatic attack and he needed some medication. So am I able to help? So indeed, I had then got some medication which my wife had brought for asthma, sent to me from the US by a doctor who was concerned about my situation. So he had sent this new medication which was supposed to be quite effective. So when this gentleman had come to me on that November 15th, I gave that medication away for that other prisoner. So 10 years on, this man says to me, I came, got that medication and gave it to that other prisoner, and it saved his life. And you know what? He came out of the prison. He's now somewhere in Europe, and he is always very grateful to you because you're providing that medication to him saved his life. Because that very week, somebody else had died of asthma in some prison. So when he told me this story, it was very emotional for me because I realized that even though I didn't have that medication, which could have been useful for me that night when I had a really bad attack, at least it had been available for somebody, whose life was saved. And in the end, as the good Lord would have it, I was also able to survive that night into the next day and was able to be taken for medical treatment outside the prison. So in all things, we give thanks.
So this is more like a living testimony of that singular act that you did, which saved a life.
And it is those kinds of testimonies, those kinds of realities which I experienced during those months that make me always feel that they were not wasted months, as I said. They were months in which, God's hand was at work. I mean, and so you can understand why I overflow with praise.
Oh, that's interesting. But did you at any point wonder when you were going to get out of prison? Did you worry about that?
That's an interesting question. In the period when I was in some prison, I would be allowed to walk in the courtyard, sort of early evening before they took us back into the cells and locked the cell doors for the night. So I remember I started walking in that courtyard, and I started with, just like 15 times, or initially 10, 15, 20 times. And I remember that it crossed my mind that by the time I go around 100 times, I should be close to getting out of the prison. That was literally like a revelation to me. And truly, it was not long after I went around 100 times that I had that asthmatic attack and ended up going out of the prison. So I didn't expect that I would be there for long. Somehow I had the conviction that one way or the other I would be out. I never thought that it would be an asthmatic attack that would get me out of the prison. I thought that, the court processes somehow eventually would lead to my release. That was my expectation, and I was very actively pursuing those processes and, making applications, Court of Appeal, Supreme Court, and so on. So those were the things, God's ways are not our ways. But in the end, he showed me that, yes, 100 times, around the block is what you need to do in the prison, you'll be out, but not in the way that you imagine you will come out.
Well, but in the midst of it all, you chose to give thanks, be in a thanksgiving mood, and let these experiences rather give you a reason to be thankful.
You're absolutely right. I went through a lot of reflections. Some of them, of course, were these spiritual reflections that I talk about. I mean, the experience of, Paul and Silas and so on in prison in the New Testament. But there's a particular person whose experience of imprisonment was also very much on my mind. This was Pa Willie, Mr. William Oforiatta, because when I was in Legon as a student, Pa Willie would come to the University Christian Fellowship and give us a talk. And in those days, he had just come out of prison under Nkrumah. The coup had happened, after February 24, 66. And he would talk about how that experience in prison had really changed his life, because he became a Christian during his time in prison. But what struck me was how lightly he talked about the experience at that time. And, his whole manner with me, he was very much my mentor, but he almost treated me as if I was just a younger brother. He would talk to me in a very calm and easy way. And I remember he would sometimes, after he gave the talk at the Christian Fellowship, he would actually walk with me to my room in Legon Hall.
Wow.
Literally. I mean, I was 16, 17 at the time. But incidentally, my roommate then was his nephew, Duke Dankwa. So he had an extra reason for visiting our room. And, this relationship with Pa Willie continued to the extent that when he was in prison under Champong, I was one of the lawyers who represented him in trying to get him out of prison. I was junior counsel to Mr. Joe Reindorf, also of blessed memory, a great lawyer. And again, I remember those days in court, trying to seek his release. And, the arguments we made, how unjustified the imprisonment was, and so on. And so, one of the things that happened during those processes that I also will never forget is that at one sitting, he was just during a break. He was just telling stories about his experiences in prison in the colonial period, under Nkrumah, under Achampong, which was the most recent one we were dealing with. And somebody who really wasn't part of the conversation was overhearing him talk about how during the colonial period, they didn't actually keep them in prison. They would keep them like in a house, and they would be brought food and so on. And the person overhearing, just interjected, "Oh, so you people, when we thought you were suffering, you were really enjoying." And in his usual very calm and measured and dignified manner, Pa Willie just turned to him and said, "You will never understand the meaning of freedom. You will never understand the meaning of freedom."
That's heavy.
And I mean, those were words that in that moment were especially significant, because there he was, again in prison, somebody who was essentially a part of the attempt to defend his being there is talking very lightly about imprisonment in a previous era. And he says, "You'll never understand the meaning of freedom." So, however comfortable prison might seem like and so on, of course it's not pleasant. It's an experience that you would prefer not to have. But what struck me about Pa Willie through all these conversations was that even though he would not have wished to be in that situation, as he reflected back on it, he made the best of it. Then, 30 years on, I go through a similar experience, and I'm using the recall of what he had been talking about as a source of deep reflection and comfort to my soul. That's just extraordinary.
Okay, but why do you describe this as a strange experience with the law? I mean, this played out, we saw it. To say that, how you describe June 18 as the executives having a hold on the judiciary?
It was a desecration of justice. It was a desecration of justice. Justice was just thrown aside, and perhaps it's worth recalling that when I was first taken before the fast-track court, I was taken to the court in the name of the president. The summons was in the name of the president. No, it was not regular for that to happen, but that was the summons. In fact, that was one of the challenges that I had before the Supreme Court in respect of the summons. And so that desecration of justice from the beginning was in the name of the president. And I think when justice is sought to be done in the name of the president, it leads to a desecration. On November 30th, 2016, when the Court of Appeal set aside the judgment and acquitted and discharged me, that was a restoration of justice.
That's what, thank you.